for anyone listening, it's worth thinking about your own diet and saying, oh, do I actually include something from all 6 plant-based food groups, most days? So it's the whole grains, the nuts and seeds, fruit, veg, legumes, so they're the beans and pulses, and herbs and spices. And the science shows people who have more different types of plants in their diet, actually those who can get 30 different types in their diet per week, have better gut health than those who eat the same foods on repeat.
So I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Megan Rossi. I'm just so excited. I've been revisiting your book this morning, your latest one, and it's just so inspiring and just how healthy and good plants are for us, Megan. First of all, a very warm welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's so exciting. I think a really good place to start, because I think you make everything look so simple and it's so accessible for people, is can you break down your concept of the diversity diet? Because I love this idea of us being inclusive and adding more things in rather than trying to take things out.
Yeah, so I guess the premise of the diet really came from this wealth of scientific evidence about how we should be eating to not only nourish the human cells in our body, but the trillions of microorganisms like the bacteria that, the science is discovering does so much for us in terms of things like supporting our mental health, our heart health, our skin health. So it's about translating that hard science into a very practical way of eating, which is underpinned by 5 key principles. So the first one is about enjoying mostly plants, but that doesn't necessarily mean only plants. And I think that's an important principle because we tend to be extremists. So we either go 100% plants only, or we go loads and loads of meat, where the science is showing that kind of where we sit in the middle of that is kind of the idea, where most of our diet is plants. But hey, if you want to add some animal products on top of that, because some of them can be really good sources of nutrition, like oily fish is a great source of omega-3, which is really important for our gut microbes as well as our mental health. Whatever you add on top of those plants is completely up to you. So first one is mostly plants. The second principle is diversity all the way. And this, I guess, is a new understanding, again, coming from the gut microbiome research, so about those bacteria, which highlights that actually our bacteria like as many different types of plants. And I think for a lot of busy people, we tend to just have it by. So we'll buy kind of the same fruit and veg on repeat, the same grains, and probably forget about things like legumes and, nuts and seeds. So I talk about this, these group of plants called the Super 6, and it's just the 6 plant-based food categories. So for anyone listening, it's worth thinking about your own diet and saying, oh, do I actually include something from all 6 plant-based food groups, most days? So it's the whole grains, the nuts and seeds, fruit, veg, legumes, so they're the beans and pulses, and herbs and spices. And the science shows people who have more different types of plants in their diet, actually those who can get 30 different types in their diet per week, have better gut health than those who eat the same foods on repeat. So that's the second principle, diversity all the way. The third one is around whole, not refined. And this is something that I think, is an important one to talk about, because this trend to go vegan, to go 100% plant-based is really coming hard and fast. And a lot of the fast food, restaurants are now having these, vegan sausage rolls and vegan burgers and things like that. And there's a myth out there that these are actually healthier to eat than the meat containing alternatives. But what we're seeing is that through that processing, actually, we lose a lot of that plant nutrition. So when we talk about enjoying mostly plants, it's actually having whole plants where you can, versus these kind of ultra processed soy burgers. So in the book, I have all these recipes of, they take 10 minutes to make, plant-based burgers that you can put in the freezer. And then if you're having something like a barbecue, you can whip them out and defrost them. So it's about trying to have these whole foods wherever you can. The fourth principle is about ensuring that you think about the kind of community feel of food. So it's about tasting, pausing, and enjoying. And I think this is lost in a lot of kind of these, the dieting world, where people just think food as just a health element to it, but actually we know that food should be enjoyed. If we have pleasure in food, actually the studies have shown we're more likely to live longer and able to kind of stick to healthier eating principles. So it's about saying, you can absolutely, enjoy those favorite foods, and it's just about being mindful with how, you're eating, those sorts of treat foods. And then the fifth and final principle is thinking about what you're including versus excluding. So what you're adding in, not not taking out. And that, feeds into the concept that, yeah, enjoy your favorite foods, but hey, why don't you add plants along it? So if one of your favorite meals is a bolognese, a meat-based bolognese, I'm never going to say you can't have that. What I'm going to say is, hey, why don't you add in extra things like lentils and some frozen veg to really up the amount of plants that you're getting from that? And actually that attitude of thinking about what you add into your diet versus what you cut out, again, helps with compliance in terms of longer periods where you can actually stick and start to enjoy this way of eating, which, the science shows you actually, your taste buds adapt to eating more plants, and then you start to crave them as well. So if anyone's like, I don't like plants, your taste buds do evolve. And also it's about how you cook with them, what flavors you work with to really up kind of that mouth feel and that desirability.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you end up craving what you eat, actually. So the more healthy food you eat, the healthier you want to eat, right? And it's the same with junk food. And you make it so easy. I mean, the recipes are absolutely delicious in the book, and they're flexible. That's what I like about it. They're not, it's a bit like some of them, you can have a wrap, for example. It's not like you've deliberately excluded and gone, right, we must be gluten-free. And it's not restrictive. And that's what I like about the approach. You also make it very simple, and I think this is really interesting for listeners, where you measure out the portions so people can see, am I going to get my full 30? And I was delighted when you put coffee in there as one, and things like cashew nuts, but you kind of moderate the amount in terms of how many points that counts for. Can you explain a bit like that? Because I know that's going to be music to many people's ears, hearing that they can include coffee, albeit at a lower amount. How does this point system work? Because I think it's really useful for people.
Yeah, so this came off the back of the research, which showed those who ate at least 30 different types of plants per week had better gut health. So as I said at the start, the goal is to try get at least 30 different types of plants. I came up with a point system because, it helps us think, when we can add things up. And I think it can come across as quite a fun game to have either in the office or at home, where people are like, oh, how many plant points did you have today? So each individual plant is given a point. So if you have 10 strawberries versus 2 strawberries, you get just 1 point from it. So it's about encouraging that diversity. So, hey, instead of just having all your fruit from strawberries, why don't you also have an apple and a banana and some melon? So you get 4 points for every different type of plant that you have. And the same thing with legumes. So instead of just having chickpeas, hey, why don't you have butter beans to get an extra point, as well as kidney beans for an extra point? So again, it's just encouraging people to try diversify their diet wherever they can. In terms of things like your coffee, your olive oil, and your herbs and spices. Now, we also know these are really beneficial types of plants for our body, but we typically have a lot less of them. So I've given them a quarter of a point. So that's where, the portion kind of can come into it.
Oh, I've got you. Okay, so it comes down more to portion. Yeah, that makes sense. With vegetables, they count as long as we're not juicing them. And I was just curious with this, because I know, for example, I talk a lot about longevity, and some of these contain these sirtuin enhancing compounds that activate the longevity genes. And, you'll be familiar with the cert food diet, where juicing is actually a key element of that. Is this because when you're not counting juices, it's because we're looking more at fiber as opposed to micronutrient on that counting scale?
Yeah, so it's a combination of both, right? So, when we do juice, absolutely, we can get slightly more accessibility of certain types, but actually we do lose a lot of the nutrition that feeds the bacteria that's attached to the fiber. So when we are juicing, we're losing not only the dietary fiber, but we do lose some of the types of phytochemicals, so plant chemicals that are packaged within the fiber cells. So
Okay.
when we are eating the whole plants, what happens is that human cells can't digest fiber. That's one of the magical things about dietary fiber, is that it's useless to human cells. Its sole benefit is to feed the gut bacteria. So they're the unique ones with the enzymes to break down dietary fiber. So when we're eating dietary fiber, the bacteria break it down, and in doing so, they can also then access some of these kind of packaged up phytochemicals, and they manipulate them, enabling them to be absorbed and then have health benefits throughout the body. So that's why, yeah, when I talk about the the plant point system, that is one of the the diversity diet principles about having the whole, not refined. So enjoying all of the health benefits that come from those plants. Absolutely, though, if you enjoy juicing, I'm not saying don't do it, but we know that we're probably not getting the full nutrition that we could if we are relying just on juices for vegetables.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I always think if you can eat it in its whole food state, right, as nature intended, that's the way. And as we were talking before the show, weren't we, about your amazing, I've got it in front of me. It's just like the apple pharmacy. I just think it's brilliant in the book, like how much the humble apple contains, right through to like enhancing, neurotransmitters like GABA and dopamine and things like this is just amazing.
Yeah, no, I think I drew that diagram really, I guess, to highlight to people just how impressive the nutrition profile of the humble apple is. And if we extrapolate that out to pears and bananas, etc., they all have their own unique synergy of different types of chemicals. So that image there, it shows that the 300 different plant chemicals within the apple, plus the millions of bacteria that we find within each and every apple. So it's, again, just getting people to think differently about these fruits that people may be like, oh, that's a bit boring. That doesn't really have any health benefits. It's kind of rekindling their appreciation for Mother Nature.
Yeah, for sure. Makes sense. And also, I think the other thing that you and I were chatting about is, just for women, how important this is, because there's a lot on social media at the moment. And particularly, I'm really keen to kind of make people aware of the differences between men and women, right? We are definitely not small men. And I think we have different hormones like excess estrogen sometimes that we need to detoxify. And there's a lot of women kind of trying things like very restrictive ketogenic diets or going on even the carnivore diet, which is really excluding a lot of the fiber that I think we need to be able to detoxify properly. And I was just wondering if you could just kind of elaborate a little bit on that for listeners, because I think it's such an important topic area.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, I talk about the different, I guess, connections. So I talk about the gut hormone connection. I talk about the gut brain connection, the gut skin connection, and as well as the gut metabolism connection. And under the gut hormone connection, I share a study, which I think is a really important one for people going through the menopause, where it looked at people who added in extra plants to their diet compared to those who just continued on the diet they were having. And those who added in, basing their diet around plants actually had a 17% reduction in hot flushes in these women going through menopause. And I certainly see that, in my own clinic where people start to nourish their gut bacteria. In turn, some of their hormones start to kind of rebalance. And we absolutely know that our gut bacteria are really important in estrogen recycling. So they contain this enzyme which helps kind of recycle that estrogen throughout the body. So we do see quite a lot of hormone dysregulation, conditions like PCOS and endometriosis actually linked with different gut bacteria profiles. So the research needs to, I guess, uncover that understanding a little bit more in terms of the specifics. But at the moment, my advice absolutely for people who are struggling with hormones is to think about how they can add in extra plants. Again, doesn't necessarily mean only plants. Me personally, I don't eat only plants because things like fermented dairy and the oily fish, I think, are such great sources of nutrition. Although I do, of course, understand those who want to go 100% plant-based for cultural and animal cruelty and religious reasons, etc., environmental reasons. But in terms of health, going 100% vegan, according to the scientific literature, doesn't mean you're any healthier.
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult to do, right, without any supplementation at all, which is always a big kind of question mark for me, because I think actually we didn't have supplements ancestrally, so we had to get everything from our food.
Yeah, I mean, people do need to be more savvy with their nutrition if they are cutting out some of these food groups. So again, I talk about them in the book. So things like, choline, zinc, iron, B12, selenium, those are some of the key ones, calcium, iron, that people need to just be a little bit more savvier with.
Yeah, Yeah, makes sense. And as you say, you break it all down in the book. The other thing you do is I love the way you break down the phytochemicals and like the antioxidants, the hormones, the barrier warriors. That's all really, really helpful for people, because I think people know, like women often, they'll be listening and thinking, well, I know that when I have cranberry juice, it helps to protect me against urinary tract infections, but I didn't really understand why. And it's quite interesting. I wonder if you could just touch on that for people about these barrier warriors that can help support your gut and your immune system.
Yeah, so when we talk about the phytochemicals, they are those magical plant chemicals that most of which pharmaceutical world haven't been able to make it and put into pills. So there's so much that Mother Nature essentially has hanging over us, and it explains things why for so long we've seen those that the health benefits of cranberries in terms of reducing the risk of urinary tract infections. And we know that cranberries have these specific types of phytochemicals in it which help kind of protect the urinary tract in terms of preventing the different microorganisms from kind of attaching to the wall and then causing the irritation, etc. And then, we know that a lot of these phytochemicals also have these antioxidant powers. So we're constantly exposed to the oxidative stress, whether it's things like the pollution or just our own physical stress that we inflict on ourselves. And we know that a lot of these plant chemicals can also help kind of what's the word I'm looking for, can kind of mute that fire instead of adding fuel to it. These antioxidants kind of prevent it from getting out of control.
Yeah, yes, it makes so much sense. And actually, you talk as well about how to pair foods and how to enhance the bioavailability, which I think is really helpful as well. Things like adding black pepper when you're making a curry with the curcumin from turmeric. And also, I think you're mentioning some fats alongside lycopene, for example, help to increase the absorption. Because that was interesting for me, all the area on skin health as well, because I think that's really relevant for a lot of women in particular, whether they have hormonal issues or whether they're looking at kind of anti-aging. These plants really have the power to protect us against oxidative stress and aging.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really great studies out there, again, showing how adding in loads of these types of plants. There was one study I talk about, particularly the polyphenols, so the plant chemicals from cocoa, where they actually gave these to people versus a placebo, so they got a fake intervention, and actually showed, I think it was 24 weeks, having these high dose plant chemicals actually significantly reduce the appearance of things like wrinkles versus the placebo, the fake intervention. So there is actually some hard scientific studies to show that adding more plants in can have measurable impacts in our our skin health as well. In fact, we know that we've got billions of bacteria that live on our skin, kind of like a second skin, and these are really important in things like skin aging, but also in things like skin barrier protection. So anyone who's suffering with things like eczema, there's some really interesting studies looking at ways they can intervene on the skin microbiome, so the skin bacteria, to help kind of protect and treat those sorts of skin conditions. So definitely a watch this space.
And is that topical things that you can intervene with, or is this actually optimizing the microbiome to support the skin?
Yeah, so it's looking at the topical microbiome, so the skin microbiome. One of the studies actually did a skin microbiome transplant. So this might be getting too much in the science, but it's really exciting in terms of they essentially wiped the micro profile from people without eczema and transplanted it onto the skin of people with eczema, and did it obviously in a very controlled, systematic way. And the pilot data showed that actually that was able to benefit some of the people as in treating the eczema. So they're now rolling that out to larger studies to have a look at the exact mechanisms of that. So it's still very much in the research stages, but I do predict in the next 5 or so years, there will be, probably prescribed topical treatments that target, enhance the skin microbiome to facilitate kind of the management of that inflammatory skin condition.
How interesting. And what have you found in terms of your own experience and in your practice with eczema? Things that can help, or some no-nos for people, because it's a really tricky area actually to bring under control, eczema, isn't it? And often if you speak to a dermatologist, they'll be like, nope, has absolutely nothing to do with what you're eating at all. And I'm just curious what you found in your own practice.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Certainly there is really good evidence that if you are pregnant and have a family history of eczema, whether it's from dad's side or mum's side, that taking a specific probiotic throughout your pregnancy and for 6 months of Bub's life actually reduces Bub's risk of getting eczema by about 50%. So there's really strong evidence showing there is that microbial link there. However, the studies that have gone and given people specific probiotics when they already have eczema haven't proven to have a benefit. So it's a kind of a tricky stage where we're not quite sure whether we just haven't gotten the right probiotic to treat eczema at the moment, or whether actually it's the immune system's already regulated so much so that the bacteria can't override that. In my own clinic, I certainly see that stress is probably one of the key factors. So it's about working, I guess, the lifestyle factor. And I would say, there may be a small population where diet has a really remarkable impact, but I would say, yes, optimizing the diet is really important to adding more plants in. But it's certainly in most cases where it's bad eczema isn't enough to get the eczema under control. And again, I think we just don't know enough at the moment about, why that is, why there's a subset of people that might really have that transformative effect, whereas other people, it doesn't seem to, change. So I think, anyone who's listening to who is struggling, and I would definitely recommend trying to add in, follow the diversity diet for 8 weeks, see how it goes. It might have a benefit because it has for some, but I don't want people to be to have these hopes it's going to completely cure their eczema, because that's just not what the science shows at the moment. It is much more deeply regulated than that.
It's really interesting because I've been monitoring it with my own daughter. Actually, she has not bad, but a little bit of eczema, and it comes and goes. And yes, fine, you go on holiday and you go in the sun, and it seems to have some improvement. But then you're also on holiday, and what I've noticed through tracking really closely is that stress plays a huge part. If she's really under pressure at school, or there's something going on, there's exams, those types of things, there'll be a flare up. Whereas when she's completely relaxed, we may not have gone abroad, we're just at home, she's eating the same things, her eczema kind of just like, where did it go? It's amazing to see. And I think we underestimate, don't we, the impact that stress has.
Absolutely. I mean, stress is such a big one. For any inflammatory condition, right? As well as things like gut symptoms, we know that stress, irrespective of diet, can be the main trigger of gut symptoms. Of course, that's not the case for everyone. And we also know, through some of the studies, that the bacteria, nourishing them can actually help with some, mental health conditions. So, it does work both ways.
And also the other thing that's really interesting, actually, when we're on that, talking about stress and the microbiome, is I don't know if you've been using the biocidin protocol at all by Biobotanicals, but when I've used that with someone with eczema, so I had someone who actually, her skin was so red and inflamed, it was constantly cracking open. She's severe eczema. That seemed to really, really moderate it. She's like, it's changed my life, even though it's not completely gone. And I think that a lot of that is because those botanicals are not just containing, things like oregano and antibacterial and antimicrobials and putting the right things back into the microbiome, but they also contain adaptogens in terms of the blends that really support that adrenal function. So you're kind of targeting stress in the gut at the same time. And I'm sure that's partly why it's so powerful in the way it operates.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess for me, I'm like, well, I want to see a human study first before I'm going to recommend it. But I know, everyone's different, and people can be quite, desperate when it changes their life so much. So, yeah, I completely understand that.
Yeah, no, there's some interesting white papers on it. On the one thing I did want to talk to you actually about is gluten. So, some gut health doctors are very, very anti-gluten. It's not something that you exclude. You're quite an advocate of including whole grains in your diet. Can you just explain in terms of your research and where you come out on that?
Yeah, so in terms of gluten, we know it's a protein which is found in wheat, barley, and rye. And in terms of, I guess, the human studies, that unless you have celiac disease, which is about 1%, or you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is an intolerance to gluten, which the stats suggest is anywhere between 3 to 6% of the population, those people aside, people who include gluten in their diet actually seem to have a more diverse range of gut bacteria than those who restrict it unnecessarily. And that's not to say that I love gluten. I think we should be loading our plates with gluten, but what we do see is that people who are cutting out gluten, typically don't have as many of the whole grains. And a lot of these gluten-free foods actually contain less fiber, more fats, and are more ultra processed. So we need to be careful that if we are cutting something out of our diet, we need to think what we're filling it back in with, and then whether we're then not getting enough of those super six, i.e., the whole grains, the nuts and seeds, etc. So the evidence around gluten being inflammatory outside of those two conditions I spoke to is actually minimal. I mean, I'm not aware of any clinical trial in humans where they've actually shown that having gluten can be inflammatory. In fact, some of the studies in people with irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, they've done these blinded studies where they've given people gluten in these, they've made breakfast bars essentially, and the other group got fructans, which is a type of FODMAP in these breakfast bars, and they crossed the patients over, but they didn't tell them which arm they were having. And when they had the gluten arm, they didn't get symptoms. When they had the fructan arm, they did get symptoms like altered poops, bloating, etc. So actually in the IBS population, what we believe the component that people typically react to in things like wheat is the fructan component, which is a type of carbohydrate, and not the gluten component. So we need to do these really mechanistic types of studies to understand, versus people who have issues maybe with gluten automatically go, people who have issues with wheat automatically go, oh, it must be gluten, because actually there's many different things within wheat that people might not be tolerating very well. So that's kind of, essentially my view. Unless there's human clinical trials that are suggesting it can be inflammatory, until that day, I'm saying absolutely fine to include. Again, though, we don't want to just be having gluten-containing grains. There's buckwheat, quinoa, millet, so many other types of grains that we should be including. So it's about that diversification of our grains as well, in order to get the optimal health.
Yeah, it comes back to that key principle. What about soy? Because this is another one. And in terms of things like phytoestrogens and things, I feel like, from my perspective, soy just seems so heavily farmed. That would be my biggest concern around it. What are your feelings on that, and whether it's right for certain groups of women and not others, or?
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting one. I guess there is that environmental impact of soy, but also I think it's worth looking at what the human studies have shown. And I think overall they've shown things like people who include things like soy, tofu in their diet, soybeans in their diet, actually have a lower risk of developing breast cancer. And although phytoestrogens and estrogen do have some similarities, they do still work slightly differently in the body. So again, it comes down to, I always say, looking at the human, clinical trials, and so far, they've said that actually including the phytoestrogens from whole soy products, like the whole soybeans, edamame beans, are delicious, actually, has health benefits.
Yeah. And as you say, it's the whole foods, right? So you're talking there about the soybean or fermented soy, which was how it was designed to eat, as opposed to soy protein isolate in processed foods, where it's just been kind of extracted, which is, I think, or soya lattes, which is how a lot of people have been consuming it.
Yeah. Again, coming back to where you can having the whole foods, I think, is going to be the kind of the best way to optimize your health. I know it's not always, practical, but you'd be surprised that how accessible the whole form of a lot of these foods are at your local supermarkets. It's just going down the aisles that maybe you used to kind of skip.
Yeah, it's true. And just opening your mind, which you've done in the book with such lovely recipes, actually, I think to open people's minds to, a whole host of foods that they can start eating. What would you say are there any big no-nos in terms of optimizing the health of our guts that you think people should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, one of the common questions people ask me is things like food additives and and artificial sweeteners, etc. And actually my team at King's, where I work as a research fellow, is actually looking at an intervention at the moment, looking at specific food additives based on pilot studies suggesting they may have a negative effect on some people's guts, particularly those who are genetically susceptible to having gut issues like inflammatory bowel disease. So I don't certainly want to scare people, because the studies are underway and we need to understand more about the details. But again, it just comes back to that principle of trying to have the whole version versus the ultra processed version of these foods, because we know that although convenient, a lot of these kind of vegan burgers and even some of the, the milk alternatives, the plant-based alternatives, do actually have a lot of food additives in it to achieve that mouthfeel that perhaps the animal protein used to achieve. So we just need to be quite cautious about these substitutes and making sure we're not necessarily loading up our diet with loads of these food additives, because although the food additive world, there's over 400, obviously it was well regulated. A lot of that science was done before we understood about the importance of our gut microbiome. So it looked at the impact on human cells, but it didn't look at the impact on our gut microbiome. So that's why a lot of the food additives are now being retested by the European Food Safety Authority to have a look at how that's starting to impact our gut microbiome. So that's kind of some of the research that we're doing at King's to kind of validate that. So it's just worth, I think, keeping in our mind where we can is, again, having the whole versus processed versions.
Yeah, that's interesting, because also when you look at something like the difference between, well, actually like bread that's made to be longer life or wraps, they put these kind of, I don't know, they like certain things in them that you don't recognize. They're such long names. Is there any evidence that those can affect your the health of your gut microbiome? Because that's always concerned me, just to get that consistency right, to roll a wrap. Whereas there are other companies, I think it's Piadina that I love, that is just a wrap with just olive oil and salt. There's nothing else with it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm just curious, is there anything there that's showing
so
up?
there's some of the additives,
Right.
the fatty acid category that you're talking about, the esters, that we're also looking at. So there's no hard evidence that I would then recommend know when to have them. But I guess in my own diet and my family's diet, we try to limit them essentially. Although, appreciating convenience is an important one. So, again, that's where I develop the recipes in the book to be the ones that you can quickly make as alternatives, versus making people, for example, like cashew milk, squeezing out the cashews, soaking them for hours and hours. I literally just recommend people get the cashews, blend them up and make the milk that way, and it can be really creamy when you get all the nutrition. So yeah, I think it's just about quick hacks so you can achieve the health benefits of these whole foods without having to quit your job and spend all day in the kitchen.
Yeah, exactly, which no one has time to do anymore. Okay, and then in terms of, I guess the last question is in terms of the getting to 30, because I think this is a fantastic goal for people to do. When they sort of hit their 30 different plants, I know we're looking at diversity, but could they then just sort of follow those 30 every week, or should you always be trying to like mix new things in? What have you found there?
Yeah, look, it depends where people start. So the menu plans in the book, actually, if they follow that to a T, they'll be getting like 50 plant points each and every week. It's a lot easier than you think. So instead of just getting your chickpeas, you get the 3-bean mix. Instead of just getting your pumpkin seeds, you get the 4-seed mix. So where you can, don't let 30 kind of be your barrier. Push on through that. I recommend. It was just that study showed people who ate at least 30. But I'm a big advocate for trying to get in as many as you can. But again, it comes down to practicality. So if you're only at 10 types, I'm not going to say go to 50, because that that's not realistic for you. But hey, if you're at 25, I'm going to say, yeah, why don't you try go to 35, or just every week for the next 3 months, add an extra plant in. And then, people do get it, you end up getting excited about it, and it's less of a chore, and you'll be at the, grocery store and you're like, oh my God, look, I haven't tried that, for 3 months. Let me try it. Because not only of the health benefits, but the flavor that adding in diverse ranges really does adapt to your taste buds.
And have you found people get gassy when they first start it if they haven't been eating a lot of plants? Like for someone who hasn't been, maybe should they, like maybe they've just come off the carnivore or the keto diet? Do you think they should build up slowly?
Yes. So I talk about this in the book because it's a really important one to tackle, where I don't want people to be put off on adding more plants in because they get things like extra gas or tummy cramps and things like that. So I do have a sensitive gut menu plan in the book where it helps people ease their gut into having more plants if they're not used to having plants, or if they've got something like irritable bowel syndrome or these functional gut disorders where they've got a very sensitive gut. Again, I've not met a gut who can't tolerate things like legumes, so beans and pulses, despite most people with sensitive guts coming to me initially in clinic saying, I can't tolerate it. It's about going slow and steady, because your gut is amazing at adapting to these fibers and absorbing the gas that naturally gets produced when our bacteria break down fibers. So it is absolutely possible to include loads of plants in your diet, but it's about going slow and steady if you've got more of a sensitive gut, and also working on the relaxation. So essentially I talk about in the book, but there's two things you need. You need the bacteria that adapted to having the right enzymes to efficiently break down that fiber, which takes time. So that's why you go slow and steady. But the second thing you need is a relaxed gut lining, because what happens when our bacteria produce the gas when they eat fiber, the gas either has to come out the back end, goes through your gut lining, and you actually breathe it out. That's how breath tests work. Or it gets trapped in your gut if you've got a really kind of stressed gut lining. So you need to make sure your gut lining's relaxed so that gas can kind of freely come out. We breathe most of it out instead of, getting loads of gas or it getting cramped and trapped in your tummy. And to relax that gut, it's all about working on that gut brain axis. And again, I talk more about strategies to achieve that, 5 minutes a day to relax that gut brain axis. So it's kind of those two-pronged approach to really, I guess, enjoy more plants without some of the symptoms that people can get.
Yeah, I love that. I love the way you talk about the mindful eating. I think it's so important and just relaxing as well. What have you found then with things like lectins and oxalates? Are you saying that a lot of the time actually it's just building up, or do you think there's a tolerance with people?
Yeah, actually, I just did a post on lectins on social media, and I know there's been a lot of fear attached to lectins, but actually, if we are preparing our foods correctly, like, having cooked legumes, then actually the amount of lectins in these foods is so minimal that it's not going to have that toxic effect at all. In fact, a lot of animal and test tube studies coming out are starting to look at the antioxidant benefits of lectins in small quantities. So actually we think that perhaps having small amounts of things like lectins may actually have health benefits. So for me, it always comes back to checking the human studies, and human studies have clearly shown in millions of people, those who add more plants into their diet, including those ones with, small amounts of lectins, actually have better, not overall gut health, not just gut health, but also longevity. And I know there was some people who were kind of demonizing lectins and plant foods, but there has not been one human clinical trial where it's shown that having lectins in, normal amounts in a plant-based diet has negative impacts. There was one, study that showed people who ate raw legumes, the legumes weren't cooked properly. They actually had toxic levels of lectins in their diet, and then they went to hospital. But that was like an acute, I think it was at some cafeteria, and that was the only case of that occurring, and that's kind of where that diet came from. But we need to think about the millions of people who've been on, having loads of plants, which include the safe level of lectins, and thinking that actually challenging our body with some of these types of plant chemicals actually maybe how some of them have their benefit. So yeah, I think again it's an exciting area, and it's worth always thinking back to what has most of the human studies said, because we're always going to get kind of these people who might recommend kind of slightly dodgier diets, I would say, based on maybe a test tube study or some evidence that's not that strong, and it can confuse a lot of people. And I certainly see people in clinic who are avoiding legumes because they've heard they're high in lectins, and a paper published just a couple of weeks ago showed that actually adding more legumes into your diet can increase your lifespan by like 2 years. And actually legumes had the kind of the biggest bang for your buck compared to the other plant foods, and even versus reducing meat. So it's important, I think, to think about the whole body of evidence versus fixating on individual parts.
Yeah, I agree. And also, I mean, they're so tasty. They're a great source of fiber and protein, and prepared nicely. What about things like foods that are high in oxalates? What have you found? It's another one people get a bit scared of, isn't it?
Yeah, so we know that oxalates in certain foods, may reduce the calcium absorption a little bit, and even iron and things like that. But if you're having a very varied diet, you don't necessarily need to fixate on oxalates, again, unless you've got kidney issues, where your kidneys aren't able to kind of filtrate, and in those scenarios we do medically recommend people go on a lower oxalate diet for short periods of time, but also we look at the other elements of their diet. But for the average person, if you're getting in that diversity, having some of these, we call them anti-nutrients, actually, it certainly is not attached to any negative health benefits. In fact, I might share the post I did on anti-nutrients with your listeners, just so they can get, I guess, a more holistic kind of version of where these ideas have come from and what the actual body of evidence says about each of the different types of anti-nutrients, which sounds scary, I get it, but certainly the science is showing not. I mean, there's things like trying to add vitamin C to the non-heme iron in plants to really maximize their absorption. So there's a few kind of tricks and ways to kind of up the absorption, kind of limiting those kind of anti-absorptive effects of some anti-nutrients. But again, coming back to the fact that actually some of these anti-nutrients actually may have health benefits when included in kind of small doses in our diet.
That's interesting. So it's almost like making us more resilient. So a little bit with things like resveratrol, for example, right? With these hormetic compounds, effectively the plants are producing are helping us, right?
Exactly.
I'd love you to link to that. Is that a blog post? We can pop it in the show notes.
Yeah, so a social post. So yeah,
a social post. Okay, amazing.
And yeah, that's exactly right. When a plant is actually under more stress when it's grown, it's been shown to produce more of these phytochemicals, these plant chemicals, because they're kind of protective nutrients. So that's, I guess, this really exciting area of research where the test tube studies, maybe some of them show they can be inflammatory, but also they can be quite anti-inflammatory in the right doses. And that's, I guess, what Mother Nature kind of packaged them up quite perfectly to do.
Yeah, very much so. And it's really consistent with what you see in the blue zones and like the Mediterranean and places like that, isn't it? I was having actually a conversation with my wine merchant talking about, like biodynamic and organic wines. And, now there's a whole industry created around we must have dry farm wines because they're so much better for you. But actually in France, the only method of producing wine is by dry farming. And that has that natural resiliency. And I think if we kind of go back to how we were doing things, we knew what we were doing, we had it right.
Exactly. I know there's all of this kind of scaremongering going on. And often there's someone making extra money that kind of stems from a lot of these. But yeah, Blue Zone, I mean, they are the perfect group or populations to study kind of what's working. And actually one of the key principles that they have in common is actually including legumes in their diet, as well as obviously the family component. And actually that's why I included that kind of that community feel in the diversity diet, because we see, eating as a community and enjoying our food actually is something that a lot of all of the people in the blue zones kind of have in common as well.
Yeah, definitely. That enjoyment and that social cohesion and connection, so important. Before you go, and you can tell everyone where they can find more about you, because I know you're so active on social media, have 2 brilliant books. Can you tell me I'm sure people want to know this. What does a day in Dr. Megan's life look like in terms of food? Like, what's your routine? Like, how do you bring mindfulness to the day? What do you wake up and eat? Can you talk us through it? I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So, I mean, I historically had a very kind of, mindful routine in the morning. So I would take my puppy to the park. We'd then come home. We'd both have a shot of kefir. We make that at home. Then I'd have my overnight fermented oats, as well as a coffee. And then all of that's kind of like an hour, and then we'd get to work. But then I had a baby, and then I was like, oh my God, my morning routine is completely out the door. So I still have my overnight fermented oats where I use my kefir, and I make that. It literally takes 5 minutes the night before, and I have the recipe in the first book. So I still religiously do that. And I still religiously have my morning coffee. So I am a big believer in enjoying the flavors that coffee have, and also they have some health benefits as well, unless you've got gut issues, in which case go the decaf version. But they also have, heaps of those polyphenols in it. So I do really enjoy coffee. And instead of going for that, half an hour really relaxing walk, as soon as I put Bub to sleep, then I just do a 5-minute body scan to kind of reconnect and relax that gut brain axis. And my puppy just sits next to me, so a bit of a change in lifestyle. I kind of look back and think, oh my God, I can't believe I was recommending people spend 30 minutes doing mindfulness a day to any new mothers, and now I'm in the thick of it. Of course, I think as babies get older, you start to then be able to get more time back, but I think it's all about being really real, and that actually asking anyone more than like 5-10 minutes in a day can just add stress to their life, because everything else is so chaotic. But it is important, I think, to take at least that 5 to 10 minutes to do some sort of non-food related, but just mindfulness. But then, food wise, I think, what else would I have? I usually have a mixed handful of nuts in the morning. Then for lunch, I'll have usually have some sort of mixed salad with sourdough, and whether it's like salmon or tuna on it, or egg, something like that. And always have live yogurt with all of that. That's lunch.
Do you make your own live yogurt and kefir? Is that
so no, I have a brand called Biome. So I guess I make my own in terms of I developed that yogurt where it's got over 700 billion bacteria in each and every pot, 2 of the world's most studied cultures of bacteria, BB12 and Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG. So I have that live yogurt. Historically, I did make my own yogurt, because most yogurts do have a lot of fillers in it, and they don't necessarily have the bacteria that have shown health benefits. So no, now I use my Biome yogurt. I do still make my own kefir though. It's really easy to make. And then I probably have a piece of fruit in the RV, maybe some dark chocolate, and then for dinner usually something like a stir fry, where actually you can check that in the book. I've got these stir fry adventures where it's literally takes 10 minutes to make. It's on the same kind of building block principle, where you get a mixed bag of veg, mixed grains, some sort of protein of choice, and then I've got 5 different types of flavors that take like 5 minutes, like Italian type flavor, satay type flavor, Indian type flavor, where you literally, whichever night of the week it is, you just add that flavor to it. And that's just, those sorts of meals where you really don't have time or energy, but you want to feed your bacteria and your taste buds.
Yeah, amazing. I love it, because you've got the family section, the busy person section, and then the gut sensitive section. And for me, do you know, when my kids were young, I've got 3 of them, my morning routine like literally went out of the window. I thankfully got it back now, but just how life changes. Now they're at the age where they're just not going to bed at the same time. So my husband and I have just lost our evenings, so it's always this juggling act, isn't it? That's the thing.
Great. I take my hat off to you. It's an exciting journey. Obviously they're incredible, but life changes, doesn't it?
It does, dramatically. One last thing, you mentioned coffee there, and I just think people are definitely going to be interested in this, because I'm a big proponent of coffee as well, because of the antioxidants. What are your thoughts, because this is another quasi-marketing thing around coffee and mold? What are your thoughts in terms of the real exposure of coffee to mold, and how much people need to be worrying about that and the health of their gut and their body?
Yeah, look, I think that is kind of one of those scaremongering types of claims out there. If we look again at the human studies, they've shown observational studies. So people who have a couple of coffees a day actually seem to have better gut health than those who don't have coffee. So that would be very much suggestive that actually, having coffee is completely fine. You don't need to worry about that mold component. I mean, if you're getting it from a very dodgy place, when you can physically see the mold growing on top of it, then okay, definitely look at where you're sourcing it from. But if you're going with a reputable brand and you know where it's sourced from, I would not worry at all.
Don't worry. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. And so where can people find you? Because your books are fantastic. I know you're really active on social media. Please link, because listeners are going to want to come and find you, and also try out these incredible recipes as well.
So I'm at the Gut Health Doctor. So whether that's on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and then the website is just theguthealthdoctor.com.
Nice and easy. And yes, please provide us with that post, or my team will go and find it out from your social media, so everyone can learn all about lectins and more about this, because I think you're absolutely brilliant at really uncovering the facts and just kind of getting to the grit of the issue. So thank you so much, and thanks for your time today and coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. No, thanks for having me.